Hey, welcome to the Virtually Speaking podcast. My name is Pete Fletcher, and joining me as usual is my good friend, Mr. John Nicholson. John, how you doing, buddy?
Good. I'm furiously updating my lab.
Oh yeah, what, is that because vSphere 8? The big announcement at Explore,
Gotta have the new
vSphere
shiny,
8.
man.
Yeah.
You gotta have the new shiny. It's out. I hit upgrade. That's all I know. So
Just like that. Just like when your iPhone new upgrade right away, right?
yeah. Although I may need to check and see if my hardware is supported. So we should probably call someone about that.
Yeah, well, hey, man, just as normal, you are in luck. We've got the expert on the line. This podcast is dedicated to all things you need to know about vSphere 8. We haven't titled it yet, but since vSphere 8 is out, we definitely have a good friend that tends to tinker and tends to make sure he can break anything and then also automate it. And you probably know him as William Lam. William, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, guys. Thanks for having me. Funny enough, I'm also doing upgrades as well.
I bet you are. Yeah. So you've been a busy guy. vSphere 8 announced at VMware Explore. You were on stage, carrying a Nook at one point, I think, and you were talking to some VMware Cloud on AWS, but also the big announcement, vSphere 8. And I know you're also going to be at VMware Explore Barcelona because, hey, we're doing a session together, 60 minutes of virtually speaking, accelerating the journey to the cloud. So be sure to sign up for that one while there's still room. But William, vSphere 8, you've been playing with it for a while or what?
Yeah, been spending some time with it lately. I think you might have seen just a few blog posts out in the last couple of weeks. Just kind of recovering from VMware US Explorer. Definitely looking forward to Barcelona. So some of the things that I've been getting a lot of questions on even before we announced vSphere 8 was sort of, how do I go about getting started, especially from a Homelab point of view, right? We know a lot of our customers get started that way to play with our new software stack. And the easiest way is to kind of deploy it into a Homelab setting. And I wrote a blog post not too long ago, sort of, tied around Homelab considerations for vSphere 8. Definitely check it out. There are definitely a lot of different nuggets out there for users that are familiar with our ecosystem. And in fact, this past week, I've spoken to a lot of brand new users who've never really worked with ESXi. So it's really fantastic to see that, our user base continues to grow even to this day where most organizations are like 90 to 95% virtualized. And they just want to get hands-on with the latest version of vSphere 8. And they have different hardware platforms, typically like an Intel Nook, super inexpensive, 64 gigs of memory. I can put multiple NVMe drives in there. And that's great for things like, basic vSphere and virtualization, all the way up to things like vSAN, NSX, and even some of our ARIA solution. And in that blog post, it kind of helps users come in, kind of think about what do you need to consider, right? Every major release of vSphere obviously has a hardware compatibility list, and some things may be taken off the list, from our ecosystem vendors, right? They may not want to support certain types of NIC drivers, especially ones that have been around for several years.
Oh, yeah.
And so from a Homelab standpoint, you probably the first question is like, hey, can I upgrade? Are these devices going to be visible, or am I not going to lose support? And so one of the tricks that I've used ages ago, but I guess it's still not really well-known knowledge, is that you can check without doing any installation. So if you've got a hardware platform that might be a little bit aged, and you just want to be sure that your NIC drivers, your storage drivers, everything is going to be seen without problems, you can download the ESXi 8 ISO, put it onto a USB stick, boot it up, don't do any installation, right? And in fact, you can actually do an installation just on that USB key. So if you've got ESXi already installed, say like on another USB key or on existing SSD, you can leave it alone, right? That's something that a lot of folks don't realize, that you can actually install multiple versions of ESXi on the same hardware, just stored on different USB key devices. And so that's something I personally use to just validate that, like, hey, everything's up, everything's working. And so when you boot into the installer, you can jump into the console and you can take a look at, like, hey, are my NICs showing up? Are my storage devices showing up? Am I getting any warnings for CPUs? If you've got some older CPUs, there is a kernel advanced setting that you can apply that allows you to basically bypass the check. Now, obviously, for a good enterprise experience, you want to use hardware that's from the HCL, but obviously for home lab purposes, that may not always be possible, right? So a lot of tricks in that article, so definitely recommend folks check it out, even if you've been working with VMware for the past decade plus.
Now, if you do the interactive installer from the ISO, booting from the ISO, doesn't it yell at you if like there's certain devices that have been deprecated? So it'll say like, "Hey, this device is deprecated." So you should get a
Yep.
warning, I thought, if you go that route.
Absolutely, yeah. So if it doesn't see it, and we have a list of device IDs that's basically encoded into the installer, right? And so the easiest way is check is like, hey, can I see it? But you could go through the interactive installer before the last prompt, and if your CPU is not supported, you'll get a warning. And in fact, if the CPU is not supported, you will not even get a next button to proceed unless you add in that special CPU kernel bypass option. And then Nick's got a good point around the, or sorry, John. John's got a good point on the devices. It will actually show those devices and say, yep, these are no longer supported. So you as an end user know immediately like, yep, can't use this, can't install it, and we will prevent you from installing it, right? As a good bypass. And that way, you know, for sure if your hardware is going to be, you're going to have a good experience after the fact. That way it's not going to be install it and then blindly reboot and then, things aren't working anymore.
So I know, like, for instance, the Mellanox CX3, which is at this point a very ancient NIC. It was a great NIC, but that was one that was dropped. Is that something I can manually, like, copy that VIB in and try to force in a hilariously unsupported way? Or am I
Some of these devices are definitely old, and I get a lot of folks want to hold on to it, and I'm all for that as well. But some of these devices are extremely old, and ultimately these drivers aren't produced by VMware. So although we inbox the drivers, they are provided by our third-party vendors. And at some point, when we have these releases, they have to decide what do they want to support. Are there potential bugs, issues in performance? And so, they made a decision not to support it. And, the CX3, CX4s are extremely popular. And I know that they're widely deployed. But unfortunately, with 8.0, it's not going to be something that it's going to see any longer. So you will have to kind of look at some alternatives.
So I would like to go on a brief soapbox rant here before everyone gets on Reddit and says, "Oh my God, VMware is the worst for dropping support for my CPU or my NIC." VMware doesn't make these decisions. These decisions are made respectively by the server OEMs. They decide what they want to resupport. The CPU vendors, Intel makes a decision. In fact, you can go look at ARC and stuff will randomly just show up as discontinued or EOS because, frankly, I don't understand Intel's life cycle. But they make their own decisions to stop shipping microcode, and we can't keep supporting stuff that we can't get security updates on from the back end. We're grown-ups, unfortunately. And so, yeah, there are these hacks, there are these flags, but this isn't VMware. VMware isn't forcing you to buy a new server. There is no evil conspiracy. I see this repeated online repeatedly, and I get very confused because I would like to know where my check from, NVIDIA is for the making people buy a new Mellanox. So, yeah, rant over. But
well, I've noticed on, obviously vSAN 8 and vSphere 8 both have, different requirements, memory requirements specifically. Are all of those requirements when you're deploying, even, I know you've got some scripts where you auto deploy like a nested lab for, let me stand up an entire vSAN environment in this nested lab as a VApp. How is that changed with some of the increased requirements for vSAN and vSphere, if it has at all?
Right. Yeah, there's definitely some changes. Obviously, lots of exciting capabilities. vSAN ESA is another big one. And so obviously with these new functionality comes additional resource requirements, right? And that's kind of to be expected. And so earlier I spoke about, installing, vSphere 8, vSAN 8, on a physical server, for those that remember how to do that. But for me, typically, I may not always update my physical infrastructure right away, right? And I'm sure that's probably the same for many folks, right? To have something stable. And so the next best thing to be able to get your hands on the awesome features of vSphere 8 and vSAN 8 is to deploy that into a nested environment. And what that means is that you're going to basically run ESXi inside of a virtual machine, so that will mimic, your physical infrastructure. And the nice thing about that, especially if you have the additional resources, is now you can start to play with things like stretch clustering. You can play with NSX. You can start to emulate and simulate things that you might want to do in your production environment. And that's something that I've done for ages as a customer, right? The first thing when a release becomes available, I automatically script it using Kickstart. These days, we have a lot more fancy tools like, vSphere Lifecycle Manager that makes it super easy to lay down images and configurations. But being able to run that in a nested environment allows you to really learn about the new workflows. If you break something, guess what? You just delete it and redeploy. And so that's something that I built over the years. And I recently published a new vSphere 8 and vSAN 8 lab deployment script. and all you need to do is download the VCSA installer, download my nested ESXi appliance, and depending on your physical infrastructure. So for my environment, I have an old Supermicro box. So it took about 37 minutes to stand up a full vSphere environment. That's vCenter, ESXi, vSAN fully configured, turned on, and ready to start deploying your workloads. And then at that point, you've got the full stack. You can start to play with, whether it's ESA, whether you want to play with some of the new capabilities like data sets, some of the new features of VLCM. And so I really like nested virtualization for that reason, is that I can play with what I'm interested in, whether it's automation, scripting, or just kind of understanding some of the new features that we've announced.
Oh yeah, home labs are a must. I mean, whether you're a customer, a partner, whether you're just, if you're in this industry, if you can't, have a little joystick time on an environment, you're never going to learn it. And so, and that is one of the beauties of where John and I are. We have, and of course yourself, we get the ability to automatically deploy a lot of these things just on demand. We've got scripts where it's like, give me an 8 node cluster, give me a 12, give me these specs, and it just appears. But yeah, it's nice to test it. You don't need to have a physical environment to do proof of concept, to understand what some of these features are and how they work. So I think that's been kind of the beauty of virtualization in general, is just learning this stuff, and being able to do it in a nested environment is certainly it's certainly more cost effective.
Exactly. Just like we can run traditional enterprise modern applications, right? We can run our entire software stack. And it's not just for folks running vSphere. In fact, I even did a blog post on how to run vSphere 8 on Fusion and Workstation, because we actually have a lot of people who have very beefy desktop systems. Sometimes these are actually more powerful than some of the home lab kits and all that. And we have our hosted products like Fusion and Workstation. Works great, has virtual networking. And so again, that's another ideal environment. And so I recently did a blog post because there are some changes in the vCenter installer, so minor tweaks, but now you can also deploy vSphere 8 into your hosted environment, and that can just be available side by side. So think about power consumption, additional hardware that you may not need. So there's definitely a lot of different options, right? And I kind of see this as like, for those that work at VMware, we have access to infrastructure like Nimbus, which is like, hey, just give me an environment. This is sort of the Nimbus for customers and partners to kind of kick the tires on and kind of explore some of the new features.
Someone was asking me some specifics of doing nested vSAN, and I thought to myself, man, I am so bougie spoiled that like I haven't manually done that in 3 years. And I was like looking at your blogs to give them advice, because I log into a web portal and click point at a build and hit go, give me a cluster, and it just summons. It's magical. Like the first drug is nested. The next real, like, the hard stuff is getting into automation on it, and then it's game over for how easy your life becomes.
Absolutely. And I also know, obviously, there's a lot of customers that are very familiar with this. They may already have a VMware environment up and running. And so for them, they'll grab your script, they'll deploy a new environment inside their own existing vCenter server. But what about customers that are new to VMware and don't have an existing vCenter server and they want to actually start to deploy all this? What's the easiest way to get started?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways. I actually did, so as part of my exploration with vSphere 8, another area of passion of mine is around our Tanzu stack and our vSphere Tanzu and our new TKG 2.0 release. And so that was something I was really interested in getting my hands on, especially the new VM service. And another blog post, I talked about some of the really cool capabilities using Kubernetes to deploy VM-based workloads, right, as well as Kubernetes. And so, being able to stand up that stack, it can be complex, especially for new users, right? You've got your virtualization layers, that's ESXi. You've got your vSphere management layer, which is vCenter. You have your choices of storage, so it could be standard VMFS, NFS from your filers, or even things like vSAN. And then once you get into the Tanzu space, this is generally new for a lot of our typical, VI cloud admin experience, right? And so be able to learn about Kubernetes easily. And then there's also a networking component that's required, right, to be able to deliver these on-demand workloads like Kubernetes and VM workloads. So I found, working with Tanzu the past 5-6 years, networking tends to be the challenge for a lot of folks. And I put myself in that bucket. I'm not a networking person by any means, but I do have to kind of understand enough of it to kind of get by. And for our vSphere Tanzu, for folks that are familiar, we have sort of 3 different networking technologies that's available too. Just kind of depends on your needs and capabilities. So a free option is using HA proxy. So this provides the load balancing for your workloads. We also have support for both NSX-T as well as our NSX advanced load balancing, or also known as AVI. And so from a home lab point of view, people just want to get access to vSphere Tanzu, get the basics of it, and then once they get familiar with it, they might consider deploying more advanced networking solutions. And so while I've been kind of playing with the vSphere and Tanzu stack, again, networking has always been a challenge. How do you quickly get started? And because these Intel NUCs are super great for so many different use cases, vSphere, vSAN, NSX, and I was like, well, what if we can make it super easy for somebody to, basically go from bare metal to vSphere Tanzu, say in about an hour's time. And so I had put
Wow.
together a blog post a while back ago. It's still cool for vSphere 8 that allows you to install the full vSphere with Tanzu stack using H8 proxy. The other thing that I did was to say, can I install it with the minimum amount of resources? I know not everybody has infinite amount of resources. I certainly don't. 32 gigabytes seems like a fairly entry level point in terms of price and just capability wise, right? I think anything under than that, you start to get into difficulties because vCenter is going to need some amount of resources if you're doing vSAN, et cetera, right? So I say 32 gig feels like a good starting point. And funny enough, I can get the whole stack deployed and running comfortably under 32 gigs of memory, and you can even deploy like a Doom Kubernetes application, right? So that's kind of like bare minimum. If you kind of move it to 64 gigs memory, especially for these SODIMMs on these NUCs, they're fairly inexpensive, and it's super worth the investment because that means that you now have an extra 32 gigs of memory for deploying other types of workloads. And so to answer your question, to get started, I do have a series of scripts that will basically walk you through that whole process. And so you get vSphere, you can do vSAN if you wish, you don't have to. It can just be local VMFS, it can be NAS, and then stand up the rest of the Tanzu stack. And again, this is just a way to demonstrate that you can run a large part of the VMware infrastructure on fairly inexpensive hardware with minimum amount of memory resources and all that. So it doesn't have to break the bank for somebody that's kind of getting started into virtualization, or somebody that's kind of returning back and kind of interested to see what we have to offer for vSphere 8.
Well, and I had kind of had a perception that our stack required a lot of RAM to run all of these bits. And it's nice to see this not only for Homelab, but also you look at some of the edge use cases, some of the telco use cases where people are like, 30, if you can trim the memory footprint by 32 gigs, that adds up when you're looking at 50,000 sites and things like that.
Absolutely.
So there is still a focus on efficiency, it looks like.
Oh yeah, and I mean, at the end of the day, when you look at our typical stack and software, right, we're designing it to run hundreds of thousands of workloads, if not more, in the enterprise data center, high availability. So that's sort of the design principle going out the door. But when you think about like home labs, we can actually start to tune things down. You take a look at vSphere Tanzu. By default, we have a 3-node supervisor cluster, right, for things like quorum, all the good things that you want. In a home lab, you may not care. You might say, you know what, if it blows up, I'll just tear it down. And so there are little tricks here to say, yep, instead of a 3-node supervisor cluster, I actually just want one. So it's all these little tricks here and there that I've kind of learned over the years of just minimizing my own, resource footprint, and it ends up being something that's very useful. And in fact, recently I even found like a lot of engineering teams are using it for their own test beds and even for their own home labs, because again, we don't have infinite resources like, as compared to work and all that. And so being able to deploy our stack, getting that hands-on experience is really critical. And that's actually how I've learned a lot of my things, right? Is so either you want to deploy on physical because you want to try something specifically, or deploy it in a nested environment. So yeah, there's definitely lots of tricks that I've shared over the years. That's definitely worth checking out on the blog.
Yeah, for sure. It just makes me laugh, William. Because for those that are not aware, William's day job is not blogger. And yet you spend there's enough research in williamlam.com to be 3 people's full-time job. So yeah, kudos to you for that. I was actually in a customer meeting not too long ago, and they were like, it was an official customer meeting. They were actually training sales folks, and they were like, the official thing was like, we need to go and pull William Lam's script to do this thing where we analyze such and such. And I was just laughing to myself thinking like, here they're leveraging something that he wrote on a weekend, just because, hey, this will make somebody's life easier. And now it's part of, the Salesforce.
Well, and I'm sure William also suffers the challenge of all great bloggers, where you Google something and you find your own blog and you forgot you wrote it. So.
Oh yeah, I definitely see that a lot, and sometimes I forget, like, oh crap, I actually wrote about this. I feel bad because I was like, first thing I do is I actually not search my own blog, which is probably a bad advice. But I go online, and luckily Google is really great at indexing. But no, thanks for that comment, Pete. Yeah, a lot of times people think this is my day job. It's not. I just enjoy sharing what I've learned and just making it easy for our users, right? Like I said early on, we don't want these new releases to be difficult for users to get started on. There's a lot of great capabilities that's really going to solve real world business problems. And so my goal, even when I was a customer, when I enabled our internal development teams, new feature sets and all that, I'm thinking about the end users. Installing ESXi is not interesting, right? Deploying vSphere is not interesting, right? Period. Like, yeah, it's great that we've got all this technology to make it really simple, but at the end of the day, you want to learn about Kubernetes, you want to learn about storage efficiency from our storage platforms, you want to learn about management, how do you deploy next generation applications and all that. So that is like the value add. So for me to be able to create a script, it takes a few hours or whatever it takes and all that, but it's going to pay dividends, I think, personally, to help our customers really to grow themselves so they can focus on other areas, right? If you want to learn about API and automation, do it in Nested. You can break it as many times. And once you feel comfortable, you can start to apply those techniques and learnings to your actual production environment. So that's kind of the way I see it. But you're absolutely right. This is not my day job. So sometimes there are some expectations like, oh, he's going to have this done, or, hey, how come this is not ready? And, again, I've got a lot on my plate. And also the keynote coming up at Barcelona is definitely I'm going to be heads down. So you may not see as many blog posts in the next few weeks.
So just to be clear, that will be a fresh keynote. There'll be some new content there.
I can't say anything at the moment, but I think there'll be something cool for everybody. So let's just keep it at that. I'm actually, I hear like my door knocking. I feel like the lawyers and
we'll watch this space, as Chad would always say. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, well, listen, I've learned a lot from your blog as well. I mean, I've spent a lot of time working with vSphere Lifecycle Manager, and it was your blog where I discovered, because little foundation here. vSphere Lifecycle Manager, VMware gives you the ability to remediate all the hosts in your cluster to align your versions and make sure that everything still has the same setup. And you can choose to remediate all, or you can choose to just remediate an individual server. And so, yeah, it was on your blog where I actually learned that you could, leveraging the API, you could actually choose a list of ESXi hosts that you wanted to remediate, which is a huge thing for, small business, not a big deal because I'll just do manual. Larger environments, they want to have that everything across the board to be exactly the same. But there's always that one-off or a certain set of hosts that are going to be different. And so to me, hopefully this will eventually be in the software that it can be done. But I love the fact that I was able to learn on your blog post that there was a way to do it via the API.
Yeah, and I had a couple of customers ask about that. So part of that was like, if I get more than 2 requests, it probably means that it's something that is not well known and probably worth sharing. But the way that I figured that out was actually using a nested environment. And I have not played with the VLCM APIs as much. So I was like, hey, this is a great opportunity to check out the new ESX level management from VLCM, because now you can actually apply configuration profiles, right? So this is sort of eventually the replacement for host profiles in a declarative manner. So in VLCM, for those that aren't familiar with it, we're able to actually describe the images, right, at a cluster level. And so obviously I can patch and update. And in the UI, like you said, Pete, you can either do all or you can do one by one. And I was like, well, you can do one by one. So obviously the functionality is there, but it's not ideal. So I just took a look at the API and I was like, oh, the API is not only super easy to use, but it's just a list of hosts that you want, applied. And then what I've also found that it actually follows the ordering, right? So if you want a particular ordering, you just give it a list, and then VLCM does the rest magically, right? So prior to vSphere 8, the parallel remediation was 1. So if I've got a 32 node, 96 node cluster, whatever it may be, I can enter as many hosts as I want, and in that order, it will remediate each and every single one at a time. In vSphere 8, as you know, we now have the ability to set up parallel remediation. So I can still specify the order post. This is not something that you can ever do with Update Manager. And if I remember, my days as an admin, best practice was to put your vCenter, your management components in the first few ESXi hosts in the cluster, generally, numerical order, and you would have affinity rules. But when Update Manager came about, it just kind of patched whatever host randomly. And, certain times you're like, I want those 3 hosts to be fully patched. That way, if I ever have an outage, vCenter will come back online. And so now with VLCM, I can specify, my first patch cycle will be these set of hosts. right? vCenter will vMotion automatically. Once they're patched, I'll put vMotion or put vCenter back there, and then I can specify the remainder of the host. And again, it follows all the HA policies, all the parallel remediation. But the API is just simply given a list. So yeah, it's not as simple as using the UI, but it allows these users, and I'm sure others will have the same use case like you described. And hopefully we'll eventually see this capability in the UI. So again, it's another of those things where having this lab environment allows you to try things out, break things if you need to, understand how the product works, and then you can take these techniques and kind of apply it to your production environment.
And then note to VMware product management, please add that as a future feature. Very nice, very nice. Another one I saw that I thought was interesting, and it was, as of vSphere 8, was the converter. If someone wants to, say, go to VMware Cloud on AWS, maybe we can talk a little bit about that one.
Oh yeah, no, that's a great one. Yeah, actually, I just published that yesterday. Funny enough, I think a lot of people would agree with this. I think we were all kind of bummed to hear that converter was end of life a couple of years back, and luckily it wasn't for that long. It not only came back last month as a beta, but with all the help of our customers and our partners, it's officially GA. So there now is a modern version of converter. And again, the goal of converter, this initial 6.3 release, was to kind of bring it back to the parity that was there already. And then kind of up-level some of the guest operating systems and obviously add support for vSphere 7. And future releases, you'll start to see a lot more innovative capabilities and even support for like vSphere 8. But because I've been seeing a lot of customers actually interested in moving to VMware Cloud and AWS, and Converter really was the only option for them, given size of the organization, just kind of skill set. I was curious because I know that it's not an official destination for us in terms of testing point of view, but because we have vSphere 7 support and the current versions of SCDCs are a mix of vSphere 7 as well as vSphere 8, I figured like, hey, let's try a relatively recent SCDC version 1.18, which is across most of our customers' fleet and all that. And to my surprise, it just worked beautifully. Workload migrated over. I was able to power it on. So I was like, okay, cool, that works. And I know that would make a lot of customers happy because especially some, they don't have the option to wait for us to validate the version. Some of these customers are coming from like co-locations. They're time box of like, hey, I got to get my infrastructure out or I got to close up this data center. So I'm glad that this can help those customers. Obviously, vSphere is still relatively new. I don't think a lot of people have deployed it into production, but if you have a need to move workloads into a more recent release, I had also, experimented with the latest version of Converter with vSphere 8. And again, just worked. So I'm hoping to see these, officially on our test matrix and in our really in a future update. But I think for customers who still have a need to move workloads, both virtual as well as physical, right? Like we kind of laugh as like, oh, who still does physical? But we still get inquiries all the time of like, hey, I've got all these physical servers, I need to move it. And really, Converter is still one of the best tools out in the market. There's certainly a lot of alternative options from different vendors, but from a VMware standpoint, a free solution, one that a lot of folks have lived and died by, have really used Converter to really help them get off these old legacy platforms and kind of move that into new versions of vSphere releases or straight into our cloud offerings.
Very nice. Yeah. So William, I know, vSphere 8 has been, it was announced at VMware Explore US, and I know you've been tinkering with it in your lab for quite some time. So what are your overall thoughts about vSphere 8, where we are in terms of VMware with our vSphere product?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think if you looked at VMware Explore US and you kind of looked at the keynote and kind of the areas we focused on, the theme that I got out of it, especially coming into the keynote as a first timer, was that we really want to focus on accelerating workloads and really speeding and accelerating those types of workloads that you may not be expecting, whether it's some of the work that we're doing with the DPUs and starting to offload that to give you back capacity and resources in your x86 host so that you can start to run more workloads. Same for things like vSAN ESA to really give you that performance for workloads, whether it's like the snapshot capabilities with something like thousands of snapshots. I think about our Tanzu stack to be able to run workloads and operating systems that just wasn't possible before. Customers can now bring in their own operating system of choice, harden that as they need be, and make that available, whether it's running a TKG guest cluster or normal workloads themselves. And again, all of this foundational infrastructure is also brought into our VMware Cloud Stack. And so now you have the ability to consume modern infrastructure and getting all the benefits, right? There's so many exciting new features in vSphere, again, focused on workloads, giving you additional metadata services, having better performance, some of the low latency things that's really targeting some of our edge telco scenario. So when I look at it from a theme standpoint, it's like workloads, and really just accelerating that and making them extremely performance. So that's kind of my takeaway, just kind of playing around with some of our latest release.
Yeah, I saw, I mean, I was looking at a lot of the features and I looked at, these are either new performance features or making existing more consumable. And I know they'll benefit more than telco, but all of them I was looking at, I was like, man, this is going to help that one weird app that people refuse to virtualize, which often is something like a SIP proxy or some weird, SBC controller. And I was like, this is really, pushing those final limits of where people are trying to hide physical boxes.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the three of us on this call, we've all been at VMware for over 5 years each, respectively, a little bit more. But we've definitely seen the maturation of the various products, whether it's vSAN, vSphere. I think vSphere 8 is definitely probably one of the more solid releases I've actually had the opportunity to play with. So I'm actually looking forward to GA, and I'm definitely looking forward to seeing you in VMware Barcelona for our session. If you are attending VMware Explore Barcelona, be sure to go to our session, 60 minutes of virtually speaking live, accelerating cloud transformation. It's going to be the three of us on this call, but also Frank Dennerman and Duncan Epping. We're going to have a good time talking about some cloud transformation. That's going to do it for me. William, thanks so much for joining us as always, and we'll see you in Barcelona.
See you guys. Thanks for having me again.